My name is Christine Best, and Cal Best was my father. He was born to Carrie and Albert Best in 1926. His father worked on the railroad. He was a porter, and he doted on his dad, but his father was away a lot. He was very tall, and when you're a little kid, he seemed like a giant. But he was a devoted family man. He just doted on his kids. And, we all flew to meet him as soon as he stepped in the door, and our mother used to bodily insert herself between us to give him a little room to relax when he came home from work. But he had 4 kids, and he was affectionate and loving. My parents were both disciplinarians because they didn't tolerate poorly behaved kids, but he was a wonderful father. My grandmother, she was really the only activist in the family. She reveled in it, but she was a civil rights worker. She was a journalist. She was a tireless advocate for people, both for Black Canadians, Native Canadians. She was known to pay people's taxes when they couldn't, so that they could keep their land. She started a newspaper, the first Black-run newspaper in Canada, the Clarion, and she was the publisher. My dad was the editor, and that's where they published the Viola Desmond story, actually.
If you don't have a paper, a means of communication, you're hopeless, in particular as a minority. Because you cut the umbilical cord.
Mrs. Best, Carrie Best, was well known in the Nova Scotia, and even though before I went to New Glasgow, I knew of Mrs. Best, and when I married and moved to New Glasgow, Mrs. Best was doing her Clarion paper, and she asked me to help with her transcripts. Of course, I type. I went to business college, so I typed. So she used to ask me at times to help her with those things.
It was the first Black newspaper in Nova Scotia. I actually found quite interestingly an issue of it from 1947 in which they had profiled some of the returning veterans, but on another page they profiled the Phil's family of Sydney, Nova Scotia, which I found very interesting because that's my mother's family, and this is before my father ever even met my mother. They were profiled in, my grandmother's newspaper. I guess it's a small world sort of a thing. But I know my dad had helped my grandmother out with the newspaper. My grandfather was a porter on the railway, so he traveled all of the time, and up until he lost his sight. So, and then after that, he was pretty much stayed at home.
Cal was fined for being in a whites-only area as a child, and I cannot express to you how it breaks my heart to see that is our historical history in Canada, and that a man who as a child had to face that kind of aversion. But at the same time, I think it really provided a foundation of the bigger fight, the fight in terms of human rights, but also in terms of where he wanted to go as an activist.
It was probably last month, one of my daughters called me and she said, you never told me Grandpa Cal got arrested, and I guess it's just something that I don't think about a lot, but I know when he and his mother went and sat in the whites only section of the theater in New Glasgow, they were arrested and thrown out, and I didn't even realize it was online, but you know what kids are like today, they'll research anything, and they found it quite interesting. I think my kids find a lot of the stuff that I took for granted growing up that I kind of knew, but you knew it as a fact, but it wasn't something that you talked a lot about. You didn't think a lot about it. My kids' generation, they seem to revel in that. They don't believe that there was racism in Canada, and they find it pretty, I guess, both shocking and interesting.
That happened when my dad was 12, and he and his mother, because his father was away so much, they often used to go to the movies. And he grew up in New Glasgow, which was a very prejudiced town, and it was quite typical for that era. And the theater was supposed to be segregated, and black people were supposed to sit upstairs, I think it was, and white people sat downstairs. But my grandmother always just sat wherever she pleased. She sat downstairs, and the theater didn't really give her a hard time about it until one day an usher, who must have been new, because if he knew her he probably wouldn't have tangled with her, asked her to move, and she declined. So she and my father were thrown out of the theater, and I think they were given a ticket, and she fought it. She went to court. She tried to sue the movie theater for, I think, injury to her pride, and the judge threw the case out because he ruled that as a Negro she didn't have any pride to injure.
As an example, for blacks, they were considered less than a man. Obviously, there was a struggle regarding voting rights or any type of basic civil human rights that we had back in the days. If you look at a Canadian perspective, obviously coming from Nova Scotia, they were considered less than human beings. They were second-class citizens. And I know that Cal and his mother founded the newspaper, The Clarion. They were explaining social justice, what was happening with the black community within Halifax, on how they could fight and also raise their profile in order to fight for human rights. But at the same time, it was still the 1940s, and when you look at the United States, the 40s and 50s and 60s, there was still a lot of segregation.
Absolutely essential to the advancement of the visible minority, the racially visible community, as well as all the equity groups in Canada, is a strong public administration. If we do not have a strong, vibrant public sector that attracts good minds, beautiful minds, we will not have institutions that defend the public interest. We need equality across the board. We cannot determine quality in this country by the amount of money you have in your bank account or how successful you have been with your business. It'll never happen. So what we need is young women and men to devote themselves to public administration and to dealing with all the complexities of running a complex society such as Canada. And so I encourage people to follow the lead, the trail that Cal Best laid out for us half a century ago. We need to go back to the future. We need to listen to what this man said. We need to find out what he did, and that is the path to the future for a continued society where we can have social equality and social justice for all equity groups as well as all Canadians across the board.
Well, my name is Cal Best. In 1964, I was the national president of the Civil Service Association of Canada, which was one of the organizations that merged, or one of a number of organizations that merged to become what is now the Public Service Alliance of Canada. It was a full-time job. I was resident here in Ottawa, and I ran the national office in the organization. Well, I think the basic problem was the philosophical one about organization. Very briefly put, we believed in the association that if you worked for the government of Canada, you had one employer, regardless of the department, and therefore you should be organized in one industrial type union. It was almost a mirror of the old AFL-CIO sort of a controversy in the States, or the TLC here. The Federation had a different philosophy, and that is that if you worked for a department, that was where the primary source of your problems as an employee, and therefore they were organized along departmental lines, so that meant that we were always competing for membership in the same groups.
Sometimes we choose and sometimes we don't. Sometimes life forces us to go into a certain field. He did political science and he did public administration. As you know, he decided that was going to be his specialization. That's what he would study. And if we go back to the 1940s in Canada, and we look at a black man coming out of Nova Scotia who has studied political science, what were the chances of a black man going into politics in the 1940s and being elected to either the provincial legislature or federally to parliament here? Highly unlikely.
He studied political science, and he completed a 4-year degree in that, and then he did a year in a master's program of public administration, but at that point he actually got a job working for the civil service, so he came to Ottawa in 1949, I think it was.
Oh, it was brilliant, very smart, because even when he was quite young when he entered university, and now I am not privileged to his papers or anything like that, but he did very well, and he did very well, as you know, in later life when he graduated and went to Ottawa and became our ambassador and all those things.
I'm sure he was a trailblazer, some sort of, because I'm sure at this time when he came to Ottawa to work for the government of Canada, maybe he was the only one, or maybe one of the few blacks working in the time in Ottawa. And at the same time, going within the ranks, he always had to prove himself, like some people are doing today. They always have to try to prove themselves, even though we know that they can do the job. And by looking from his time in the civil service and becoming also an assistant deputy minister, we can see that there's a slight progression of visible minorities within the federal government, but at the same time, still to this day, it is not representative of the Canadian workforce. There's still some issues, but we are aware that it's better than before, but it's not enough because we still have systemic barriers regarding visible minorities. And also when you look at the statistics, it's always an underrepresentation of visible minorities within the federal public service compared to the Canadian population. But when they are within the federal public service, they are always overrepresented in clerical positions and underrepresented in middle management or executive positions.
And it was always, very competitive. I even remember one of the first things I did when I became president was to convince the organization to buy its own printing press, so that we could get stuff out faster than we could, with old mimeograph machines. There were other things too that we did to try to attract. I recall that one of the things that we did that got us a lot of attention is that there was a very well-known professor at McGill named Saul Frankel, who was quite an expert in civil service matters. And we made an arrangement with the university. I think it was a grant of $5,000, which was a large amount of money in those days, for Frankel to do a study on whether or not collective bargaining was feasible in the public service. Well, that got a great deal of interest among public servants of all organizations.
At the time, I would have to say in the 1950s, Cal was monumental in getting collective bargaining rights for civil servants, as they were called right now. And that foundation led to certain things like hours of work, basic pay rates. Everyone was paid this, an hourly wage. It was really putting in the infrastructure of what's now our collective agreement. And it's hard to believe, if you look at the demographics at that time, who was really working, for the federal government. It was primarily men at the time. So now, if you think about it, through those collective bargaining rounds, we now have what's known as maternity leave, paternity leave. We have a really expanded definition of family, but I imagine that collective agreement in the beginning was very thin compared to what we have now.
It was the fact that collective bargaining was on the horizon, and Cal and I could see that we needed to do something, and the pressures were on at that stage from 1963 on for unity between the two organizations, and it was that unity emphasis and Cal and I wanting to achieve unity of the two organizations because we could see on the horizon the collective bargaining situation developing, and we'd never been able to focus it. We'd never been able to operate in a collective bargaining milieu unless we had unity.
My dad was a pioneer, but just because he happened to be one of the first, and it wasn't something that he sought out, but he knew that there were job opportunities in the civil service. He wrote the exams, he came in, and he loved it, and he felt it was an honor to work for the people of Canada, and he was, there's some pretty negative stereotypes about civil servants, but I think if anyone knew my dad, it would dissolve immediately, because to me he was the epitome of a hardworking, professional, dedicated person, and he was proud of what he did.
Quietly and intelligently effective. A person who was absolutely of a brilliant mind and did not call attention to himself, just really worked very hard to make Canada a much better place to live, a much better society.
Cal, this is pretty simple from what we've heard as racialized workers within the federal public service. Stand tall, be proud, walk tall, and people will respect you. That's what you did. And that's what we are doing today.